The termination letter was already in the HR system when Alan Mercer walked out of the Hargrove and Dillon headquarters for the last time, carrying nothing but a worn canvas tote bag and the small red thermos his 8-year-old son had painted for him at the school art fair 2 Christmases ago, back when their family was still whole. Behind him, the glass doors sealed shut with a quiet mechanical hiss. Inside, colleagues exchanged glances over their monitors. Some assumed he had finally cracked under pressure. Others said he was throwing away the best opportunity a tradesman from Sudbury could ever hope to reach in a city like Toronto. What none of them understood, what none of them had ever bothered to ask about, was what it actually cost to keep showing up every morning when you were doing it completely alone. Alan Mercer had been a facilities and operations manager at Hargrove and Dillon for 11 years. He was the calm man who fixed things before anyone else noticed they were broken. He memorized the maintenance schedule of 3 buildings, the way other people memorized hockey scores. He covered weekend shifts without being asked. He answered calls at 2 in the morning when the heating failed at the downtown branch during a January cold snap that pushed wind chill to -38. He never complained, not once, and in 11 years, the company had repaid his loyalty with 2 modest raises, a parking spot that got reassigned without notice, and a supervisor who mispronounced his name at every all-staff meeting, until the day Alan stopped correcting him. But none of that was the reason he left. The reason was a Thursday afternoon voicemail that he listened to standing in the corridor, outside a boardroom, where a quarterly review was running 40 minutes over time. The voice on the message was calm and professional. The after-school care coordinator at St. Brendan's, letting Alan know that his son, Oliver, had been sitting in the front office since 4:15, because no one had come to pick him up. It was now 5:45. Oliver had not cried, the coordinator said carefully, but he had stopped talking about an hour ago, and he kept watching the door. Alan did not go back into that boardroom. He drove to St. Brendan's with his hazards on through evening traffic, and when he found Oliver sitting alone on a plastic chair, with his backpack in his lap, and his coat already zipped to the chin, ready to leave, the moment his father appeared, something in Alan quietly came apart. Oliver didn't say anything on the drive home. He just held his thermos and looked out the window at the lights along Bloor Street. That night, after Oliver was asleep, Alan sat at the kitchen table with a stack of bills he had been shuffling around for 3 weeks and a legal pad where he kept a running list of things he needed to do. Underneath call insurance, Maura's estate and find O's winter boots and book dentist was a line he had written and crossed out twice before. Figure out what we're doing. Maura had been gone for 2 years. 2 years of Alan learning how to cook more than 4 things, how to navigate the school calendar, how to explain to a grieving child why some mornings were harder than others, without having a real answer himself. 2 years of his mother driving down from Sudbury twice a month to help, of Alan's sister texting check-in emojis he never quite knew how to respond to, of Oliver asking questions Alan answered as honestly as he could, and sometimes answering with silence, because silence was all he had. The job had been the one constant, and the job had just shown him, clearly, where it placed them. He resigned the following Monday. His supervisor accepted the notice with the particular blankness of someone who considers personnel a logistical matter. Alan cleaned out his locker, returned his keycard, and drove home in the middle of a workday for the first time in 11 years. The news reached Hargrove and Dillon's CEO in a 3-line email flagged as routine. Sandra Reeves was 41 years old, and had been leading the company for 4 years, having taken it from a mid-size regional property management firm to one of the fastest-growing commercial real estate operators in Ontario. She was known for precision, for speed, and for a particular brand of controlled intensity that her colleagues described as either inspiring or terrifying, depending on which side of a quarterly target they happened to be standing on. She read the email about Alan's resignation between 2 back-to-back calls, noted that his projects would need to be reassigned, and moved on. 3 weeks later, the HVAC system in their largest commercial property failed without warning during a heat advisory in late August. The building housed 4 anchor tenants, 2 of which had penalty clauses for climate control disruptions written into their leases. Sandra's operations team scrambled. They brought in 2 external contractors. One quoted a timeline of 9 days. The other couldn't start until after Labor Day. Nobody inside the company could tell Sandra what Alan would have told her in the first 10 minutes. Where the fault actually was, what part was needed, which supplier in the city kept it in stock on weekends, and how to get it done in 48 hours. On the fourth day, when the situation had moved from urgent to genuinely costly, Sandra's director of operations said something she didn't expect. He told her that Alan had flagged that exact system for preventive maintenance in a report submitted 7 months earlier. The report had gone to his supervisor. His supervisor had deprioritized it in favor of a cosmetic renovation the property director had pushed through before a client tour. Sandra read the report that evening in her office. It was meticulous. Detailed photographs, part numbers, projected failure timeline, cost comparison between preventive repair and reactive repair. Alan had even noted the name and direct line of the supplier. At the bottom, in plain language, he had written, "Recommend action before summer. Delay will be significantly more expensive." She set the report down and sat for a long moment in the quiet of her office, 22 floors above King Street, looking at the lights of the city below. Sandra Reeves had grown up the daughter of a single mother, who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry in Hamilton. She had earned a scholarship, then a business degree, then an MBA, then every position she had ever held, through relentless focused effort. She believed, genuinely, that people who were good at their work were rewarded for it. She had built her entire professional identity on that belief, and sitting alone in her glass-walled office at 9:30 on a Thursday night, she was beginning to understand that she had been running a company where that belief had not, in fact, been true. She asked HR for Alan's address the next morning. The drive to his neighborhood took her east on the Danforth, and then south, through streets that grew gradually quieter and more residential. Alan's building was a solid red brick low-rise on a side street, the kind of apartment block that had been there since the 70s and wore its age honestly. A small bicycle was locked to the railing outside the entrance. The buzzer panel had some labels written in marker and some worn entirely blank. Sandra stood in front of the building for a moment before pressing the button. She was wearing the same suit she'd worn to a lender meeting that morning. It felt suddenly like the wrong thing. Alan answered the door in a gray t-shirt and work jeans, a dish towel folded over his shoulder. Behind him, the apartment was small but ordered. Tools arranged on a workbench against one wall, a bookshelf overflowing with field guides and library books. Oliver's drawings taped across the refrigerator in overlapping layers of color. A radio played something low in the background, a station that seemed to be doing a quiet jazz hour on a Wednesday afternoon. Alan looked at her. He wasn't hostile, or particularly surprised, but there was something in his expression that told her he had already done the math on why she might be there. He said her name, then waited. Sandra introduced herself properly, which she recognized immediately as unnecessary. He knew who she was. She explained the situation at the King Street property. She told him about the HVAC failure, and the contractor timeline and the tenant penalty clauses. She was precise and accurate. She realized mid-sentence, essentially presenting him with a business case for why he should return to do something she had already failed to compensate him fairly for doing. She stopped speaking. Alan leaned in the doorframe. He said he appreciated her coming in person, then he said no. He said it simply, not unkindly. He said he had left because the job had cost him things that didn't appear on any budget report, and that he was not willing to keep paying that price. He said Oliver had started grade 3 last week, and that Alan had been there to walk him to the door, which was the first time in 3 years he'd managed it. He said this without drama, just as a fact. A thing that had happened and mattered. Sandra didn't have a response for that, which, she would later think, told her something. Before she left, Oliver came around the corner from the hallway in sock feet, holding a paperback with a spaceship on the cover. He looked at Sandra with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned to perform indifference, then asked his father if his friends wanted staying for dinner. Alan told him she was just heading out. Oliver considered this, then said, seriously, that there was leftover lentil soup if she wanted some. Sandra thanked him. She said some other time maybe. She drove home on autopilot, barely registering the traffic. Her condo was on the 43rd floor of a building in Liberty Village, with floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen she rarely used, and a living room, where the furniture was exactly where the interior designer had placed it 2 years ago. She poured a glass of water, and stood at the window, looking west toward the lake, and tried to remember the last time someone had offered her soup. In the weeks that followed, Sandra found herself thinking about that apartment in ways she couldn't easily account for. She thought about the drawings on the refrigerator, the library books, the thermos on the counter with a crooked painted sun on the side that Oliver had clearly made. She had walked through that apartment and seen the evidence of a man who was, by any material measure, managing on less than he deserved, and who had still managed to build something warm inside it. Her own apartment was worth 14 times the rent Alan paid. She had a meal delivery subscription she largely forgot about. She had not spoken to her brother in 4 months, because they kept meaning to find a time. She told herself these were separate things. They were not separate things. She began making quiet inquiries. She called Alan's former supervisor directly, something she hadn't done before, and asked him plainly why the maintenance report had been deprioritized. The answer involved a client visit, and a budget cycle, and a series of reasonable-sounding explanations that, accumulated together, amounted to a system that consistently rewarded what was visible, and deferred what was essential. She asked HR to pull Alan's full compensation history against the responsibilities he'd carried. The gap between the two was not subtle. She called her director of operations into her office, and asked him what he knew about Alan's caseload in his final year. He told her, and as she listened, she started making notes. Not operational notes, structural ones. One evening, about 5 weeks after her first visit, Sandra drove back east on the Danforth. This time she brought nothing except an envelope and what felt uncomfortably like uncertainty, which was not a sensation she was accustomed to, or particularly good at sitting with. Alan opened the door. He didn't look surprised to see her. He looked, she thought, like a man who had decided something, and was at peace with it. Behind him the apartment was warm with the sound of Oliver doing something in the kitchen that involved more clanging than was strictly necessary. Sandra held out the envelope. She told him it wasn't a contract. He took it and looked at it without opening it. He asked what it was. She told him it was a written commitment. She had decided to restructure how the operations division functioned, including a formal policy requiring that maintenance reports be actioned within 30 days, or escalated with written explanation. She told him the compensation structure for all facilities, staff was being reviewed externally, and would be corrected. She told him she was creating a position, Director of Facilities Integrity, which was a title she had chosen with some care, that would report directly to her. No middle layer, no quietly buried reports. She told him that position was his if he wanted it. Flexible hours, including school pickup, built into the schedule as a protected commitment, profit participation. A benefits package that actually covered the things it claimed to cover, and a guarantee in writing that no employee under her would ever again be treated as though their institutional knowledge was replaceable on a 2-week notice. Alan was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd look at it. Sandra nodded. She started to turn to leave. Then Oliver appeared from the kitchen, holding 2 bowls, one in each hand, with the extreme care of a child, transporting something precious and spillable. He announced that the soup was ready, and that he had made it himself mostly, with help, and that there was enough for 3. He looked at Sandra. He said, with great seriousness, that it was tomato, from a can, but he had added stuff. Sandra looked at Alan. Alan looked at the envelope in his hands, then at his son, then back at Sandra. He said she might as well come in. They sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, while the radio played and the September evening came in blue through the window above the sink. Oliver explained, at considerable length, his theory that the astronauts on the book cover were actually time travelers, not space explorers, and that the difference mattered. Sandra asked clarifying questions. Usson listened to both of them. It was, Sandra thought later, the strangest boardroom she had ever sat in, and the only one where she had said anything that felt entirely true. She left at 8 o'clock, after helping Oliver with a word search puzzle that involved animals of the Canadian Shield. On the drive home, at a red light on Parliament Street, she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had spent 2 hours not thinking about the company. She also realized she didn't feel empty about it. She felt the opposite of empty. She sat with that for a while. Alan called her 3 days later. He said he had read the commitment letter twice, and had a few questions, which they worked through carefully over the course of an hour. At the end of the call, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was going to say yes, on one condition: that the things she had written down were treated as actual commitments, not aspirational language. Sandra said that was the only kind of commitment she knew how to make. He started the following Monday. The first morning, he walked Oliver to the door of St. Brendan's, same as the week before and the week before that. Oliver pulled his backpack straps level, and told his father to have a good day at his new job. Alan told him to have a good day at his very old school. Oliver found this sufficiently amusing. He went inside, stood a sidewalk for a moment in the early September sun, watching the door close, then walked back to his truck and drove downtown. What happened inside Hargrove and Dillon over the following months wasn't dramatic. At least not in the way reorganizations usually are. There was no single announcement, no all-hands meeting with a motivational speaker and a slide deck. There were smaller things. Maintenance reports that got read, emails that got answered, a facilities coordinator in the Mississauga branch, who had been requesting the same equipment upgrade for 8 months, and received it 6 weeks after Alan started, because Alan had reviewed the backlog on his second week, and flagged it as both reasonable and overdue. There was a part-time cleaning supervisor, named Frances Whittaker, 47 years old, who had been quietly carrying a portfolio twice her job description for 3 years, because the person above her had left, and nobody had filled the position. Alan noticed within a month. He brought it to Sandra. The position was posted, filled, and Frances was formally recognized and compensated for what she had actually been doing. She sent Alan a card. He kept it on his workbench. Sandra noticed things changing that she hadn't predicted in any operational model. People started solving problems earlier. They started flagging risks instead of quietly hoping they'd resolve. The King Street building had its highest tenant satisfaction scores in 4 years. A mid-size firm they'd been courting for 2 years signed a lease in November, citing reliability and responsiveness as deciding factors. And Sandra herself changed, in ways that were harder to measure. She started leaving the office at a time that allowed her to eat dinner while it was still warm. She called her brother. She started keeping better track of the people around her. Not their outputs, but the actual texture of what they were carrying. She and Alan saw each other often in the course of work, and sometimes outside of it. He invited her to Oliver's school concert in December, the one where Oliver played the recorder, with the focused intensity of someone who had been told this mattered, and had decided to take that seriously. She sat 2 rows back and watched Alan recording the whole thing on his phone at an angle that would definitely result in a blurry video. And she thought about what he had told her. That evening in the apartment when she had finally been honest about what she didn't have. He had said, "The things that hold don't come from being strong enough to not need anyone. They come from deciding that some people are worth showing up for, even when it's inconvenient. Even when it costs you." He had said it quietly, without any intention of being wise. Which was, she suspected, the reason it landed the way it did. She was not a person who changed quickly, neither was Alan. They were both people who had been shaped by hard years into a kind of careful self-sufficiency, and unlearning that kind of caution takes time. But there was an honesty between them that built gradually, the way trust between people who have each been disappointed tends to build, slowly, with evidence, and then suddenly, with more certainty than either one expected. Oliver helped. Oliver helped in the way children do, by being entirely uncomplicated about things that adults make unnecessarily complicated. He accepted Sandra the way he accepted most things, with curiosity first, loyalty once earned, and a running commentary on whatever book he was currently reading that neither adult had requested but both had come to look forward to. One Saturday in late February, the 3 of them drove up to Algonquin Park, because Alan had promised Oliver a winter hike, and Sandra had mentioned, without quite meaning to, that she had never snowshoed. The trail was quiet and white, and cold in a way that felt clean rather than brutal. Oliver fell down 6 times, and treated each one as a minor interruption. Sandra fell down twice, and treated each one like a structural failure until Alan offered his hand, and she took it, which she did without thinking, and then thought about for the rest of the walk. Driving back down Highway 60 in the late afternoon, with Oliver asleep in the back seat, the sky going orange and rose behind the tree line, Alan said something she hadn't expected. He said that for a long time after Maura died, he had been convinced that the right thing to do was to keep everything exactly contained. To manage, to provide, to not require anything from anyone. Because that was how you protected the people who were counting on you. He said Oliver had been the one to start dismantling that, slowly, just by existing and needing and loving without strategy. And he said that Sandra had done something Oliver hadn't, which was show him that it was possible to change. To genuinely turn towards something, even when you'd spent years running the other way. Sandra looked out the passenger window at the passing pines. She said she didn't know if she deserved that. Alan said that wasn't really the question. She didn't answer right away, she watched the trees. Then she said, quietly, that she was glad he'd opened the door. He said so was he. By the time spring came, something had settled between them that didn't require naming. Oliver had started calling Sandra by her first name, which was a thing he'd asked permission for with characteristic formality. Francis Whitaker had applied for a professional development program and been approved, the first facilities staff member to receive that benefit in 6 years. The King Street building passed its annual inspection without a single flag, and Alan Mercer, who had walked out of a glass building the previous August carrying a painted thermos, and not much else, was driving to work each morning at a reasonable hour and coming home each evening at a time that still allowed him to hear about the time travelers. There's a particular kind of strength that doesn't photograph well and doesn't make for easy headlines. It's the kind that gets up before sunrise to make breakfast for someone else, that reads maintenance reports no one asked for, that says no when no is the honest sir, and yes only when yes means something. It's the kind that rebuilds slowly, carefully, from the inside out, and asks nothing for the effort except the chance to keep going. Most workplaces don't build systems around that kind of person. They build systems that use them until they're gone, then discover too late what the silence costs. Sandra Reeves understood that now, and she had decided, not as a business insight, but as a matter of conscience, that the place she ran would be different. If this story stayed with you, think about someone in your life who carries more than they let on, who shows up quietly and asks for less than they give. We don't always know who those people are until they're no longer there. And if you believe that workplaces, and people, can actually change, share this with someone who needs to hear it today.